Hello Netrunner fans and welcome to my review of 23 Seconds. This is the first data pack in the Flashpoint cycle, which is the 6th overall cycle for Android Netrunner. In part 1 of this video, we're going to look at the runner cards in the pack. Part 2, we'll look at all the corp cards. First up, we have a new event for Anarch. This is System Outage. It's 1 to play, it's 2 influence, it's a current, which means it's not trashed until another current is played or the corp scores an agenda. Whenever the corp draws 1 or more cards, he or she loses a credit if it's not the first time he or she has drawn cards this turn. This is kind of a strange card out of Anarch. I would definitely expect this to be more of a criminal card, especially given that it has a lot of synergy with the Fisk stuff, both the ID Laramie Fisk and Fisk Investment Seminar. It also reminds me of Gorman Drip a little bit, another criminal card. Within Anarch, really all we have is things that are going to trash their hand, and that might incentivize them to draw cards, but we don't really have a whole lot of good ways to force the corp to draw cards. I don't know. I don't think this is going to see a lot of play, especially out of Anarch. I could maybe see it if we get that sort of force them to draw style out of Criminal, this being a decent splash, but I don't know, I'm just really not seeing the appeal of this card. Next up, we have a new ID for Anarch. This is Null Whistleblower. He's a 45-15 like normal, he's no link, he's a natural. Once per turn when you encounter a piece of ice, you may trash 1 card from your grip. If you do, that ice has -2 strength for the remainder of this run. This is pretty obviously good, and I would anticipate this ID seeing some play right out of the pack. It has some very, very obvious synergy with the icebreakers that we've been using pretty much since the beginning of time with Anarch. So we're talking Mimic, Yogg, Parasite. All 3 of those are going to be really, really good with this guy. And it could obviously also save you credits if you're pumping up strength on a conventional icebreaker like Corroder. This ID to me seems like it's really going to be the good stuff Anarch style, the very generic play standard breakers, maybe even like successful run-oriented economy. I think this is going to produce an incredibly standard-looking Anarch deck, and that's actually kind of my biggest complaint about this ID. This seems very rich get richer to me. It really encourages you to play an area of the Anarch card pool that we already play extensively, maybe even exclusively. So that's a little disappointing for me. Next up, we have a new piece of hardware for Criminal. This is GPI Nettrap. It's 3 to install, it's 2 influence. Whenever you approach a piece of ice, you may expose it. You may then trash this to jack out. Here's a card that looks along the same lines as the au revoir sort of strategy that we've been seeing out of Criminal. Though this has the significant disadvantage versus Snitch, that with Snitch, you can jack out every single time you use its ability. This is only going to work that 1 time since you have to trash it. Now, we do have an advantage with this card over Snitch, that with Snitch you can only use it once per run. This would allow you to expose every piece of unrezzed ice you encounter, so I guess that is an advantage. I know I'll get some hate if I don't bring up Blackguard, which has really good synergy with both this new card and Snitch. Could maybe be a thing for this deck, but I haven't really ever seen somebody be very successful with that card, mainly for the obvious reason of it costs 11 to install. It seems to me like that's a ton of setup, and it's really, really expensive to get all the components you need installed in play. That's going to take you a long time. You got to draw lots of cards, spend lots of credits, and then when you're done, you're going to have this engine that'll allow you to bankrupt the corp. Well, I can think of a lot better way to bankrupt the corp. You may have heard of the card Account Siphon. Next up, we have a new resource for Criminal. This is Hernando Cortes. He's 2 to install, 1 influence, he's unique, he's a resource connection. If the corp has at least 10 credits, as an additional cost to res each piece of ice, the corp must spend credits equal to the number of subroutines on that ice. This is presumably the Cortes of Cortes chip fame, And the ability here is kind of similar to that piece of hardware, with the critical exception of this only works if the corp has at least 10 credits. That seems like a massive limiter on this thing. A lot of times we've seen criminal decks that have sort of a denial strategy where they spam Siphon over and over and they just try to keep the corp at a really low credit total. And this guy would really fit in with that style if it weren't for that clause about 10 credits. Now, maybe in the situation where the corp has dug themselves out of the Siphon hole, you could use this to kind of drag them back into that denial setup. But I don't know, 10 credits is a lot. And if you can stabilize at 10, 15 credits, I feel like you've gone a long way to beating the Siphon spam sort of thing. This could be pretty scary with things that de-res the ice. And we have a few of those within criminal, so maybe using that sort of strategy could be a way to abuse this guy. Also at 1 influence, this is pretty easy to splash in another sort of denial deck, like a Reyna style headlock. Maybe that could be decent. I don't know, this guy's not blowing me away, but I do think that he could see some play. He's got synergy with cards that we already have, and forcing the corp to spend more to res their ice is going to be decent. Next up, we have a new console for Shaper. This is Mirror. It's 3 to install, it's 3 influence, it's unique as they are. It gives you +2 MU. Whenever you make a successful run on R&D, you may replace 1 spent recurring credit, and then it's limit 1 console per player as they all are. Here's a pretty decent new console for Shaper, the second of which we've seen recently. If you remember in my review of Maya, I was complaining a lot about how Shaper consoles are generally either really expensive or called Astrolabe, and that just really made most decks play Astrolabe, but Maya I really thought was playable as a 3-cost 2MU console. Well, here we have another one of those, and this ability is going to be pretty useful with 2 classes of cards that I can think of. The first one, I think the best and most impactful, is the stealth setup. All of the stealth setup relies on recurring credits attached to cards, and this is going to be a way to refill them, especially after you've made a run where you just spent some getting into R&D. Now on top of that, you might be able to use this with something like prepaid voice pad. If you are using prepaid as your core economy, getting a second use out of that I think is something you could do pretty often, especially if you're playing a whole ton of events like those decks tend to do. I don't really know what else to say about this thing. It's obvious to me that it's going to see play as a 3 to install 2MU console, and the fact that it has an ability that matters at all is definitely going to make it worth playing in some decks. Now I think as we'll see as we go through the rest of the pack, there's kind of a push to put stealth more into the forefront, and I think this will definitely be a good console for a stealth-oriented setup, and we'll talk about that more after we look at some of the other cards in the pack. Next up, we have a new program for Shaper. This is Die V. It's a 6 to install 1MU Icebreaker AI. It's 3 influence. It starts with 1 base strength. It has 2 credits. Break all subroutines. Use this ability only by spending credits from stealth cards. Credit +1 strength. A stealth AI breaker is certainly logical, and that's a card I think we've been anticipating for quite some time. So how does this one stack up? Well, being able to break all of the subroutines for 2 credits, that's going to be pretty decent in a lot of situations. Some of the scariest low-strength ice are scary because they have a lot of subs, and breaking them all for 2 definitely going to be decent. Now, the problem with this card comes in when you're trying to break things that have any reasonable amount of strength. Having to pump up all this strength from 1 is pretty critically bad, and I think that this is pretty clearly, to me, a supplemental icebreaker rather than the primary way you're going to deal with most ice. I'd also point out there that the current stealth setups are playing Switchblade for their Sentry Breaker, and for the most part, when we're scared of ice that have a ton of subs, it's going to be a Sentry. Well, for the same 2 stealth credits, Switchblade not only pumps itself 7 strength, but it's also going to break all subs. That's certainly a lot better against a wider range of sentries than this thing would be. And while this thing allows you to break subs that are not sentries, it's going to be really inefficient against virtually everything. Not only are you going to have the stealth, but it also starts with that one strength. When you factor in that Atman has a similar cost to install, I mean, Atman might be a little more expensive depending on the number you're setting it at, but Atman for 4, which is definitely one of the most common ways to set it up, is only 1 more to install. And Atman is going to give us a way to really efficiently deal with a certain very narrow range of ice. Really, there's nothing about Dive that's efficient, and it's not really flexible enough that you're going to be able to use it as your only breaker. So I think maybe this could be an interesting supplement to existing stealth strategies, but I certainly don't see this as being the type of thing that's going to break stealth into the mainstream or cause us to reconsider stealth over a different set of breakers. I think really if you're playing stealth, you've already got something better than this in the form of Switchblade and Refractor, and maybe to a certain extent Black Cat, and this might be a nice little supplement to those, but it's certainly not going to replace them. Next up, we have a new card for Sunny. This is Another Day, Another Paycheck. It's a 0 to play event, it's 3 influence, it's a current, and that means it's not trashed until another current is played or the corpse scores an agenda. Whenever you steal an agenda, force the corp to trace 0. If unsuccessful, the runner gains credits equal to the number of agenda points in both players' score areas. In case you're new and you're wondering what on earth is going on with this purple card, Data and Destiny introduced 3 mini factions, and this is the first card that we've seen outside of Data and Destiny that adds to those mini factions. Sunny's chief advantage is that she starts with 2 link, and that's going to make her really effective against traces. That obviously works well with this current. The corp's going to trace you with a base trace of 0, and they're going to have to pump credits into it if they want to prevent you from gaining credits. Especially against your 2 link as Sunny, that's going to be really nice. If you notice, her console kind of works the same way, and I really like this idea of the runner forcing the corp to initiate traces and then stuff happens if they fail. That's a really cool way to deal with tracing. It certainly flips the script on it, and I think this is just a really logical card for Sunny to have in her card pool. Unfortunately, like with a lot of the other mini faction cards, I don't really anticipate this seeing a whole lot of play outside of its faction. Sunny with her 2 link is going to have a lot better benefit from this than somebody with no link, and the fact that it's a 3 influence card is really, I think, the nail in the coffin. So while I conceptually like the idea of giving Sunny new stuff, I don't think we've really ever seen Sunny like all the way there. I've seen a lot of different drafted deck lists, but I don't know if anybody's really ever figured out how to build a deck around her. This is going to certainly give us something to mull over, and I really like the idea that we're going to occasionally get these other cards for the mini factions. The next card is a neutral event. It's called Deuces Wild. It's 2 to play, it's 1 influence. Resolve 2 of the following in any order. Gain 3 credits, draw 2 cards, remove 1 tag, expose 1 piece of ice, then make a run. This is a very special card because it was designed by the 2014 World Champion Dan D'Argenio. If you didn't know, when you win the World Championship of Netrunner, you get to work with the design team to create a card that not only bears your likeness, but it's of your creation. And Dan actually has another one coming out because he won the World Championship 2 years in a row, so he's got his 2015 card coming out at some time in the future. Deuces Wild is so obviously good, I'm not even really sure what to say about it. This is the type of card where it's going to be good at virtually every stage of the game. It's going to compress work that you have to do both in terms of getting you credits and drawing you cards. And then it's going to also save you credits in an action with removing a tag. I think the exposing a piece of ice is pretty strong because Generally, you're not going to be able to play expose effects in most decks. Like I've said a million times, expose effects tend to be the primary effect on the cards that have them, and that's just really not good enough to justify a deck slot. So a card like this, where it's going to be good outside of the expose effect, but then you're still going to have access to expose in critical situations, that's going to be really nice. This card is definitely going to see play. I think the one influence is going to hold it back in maybe a few decks, but this is the type of thing that you could pretty much put it into any deck and it's going to do something useful for you. I would point out that this is really, really strong in the prepaid voice pad economy, and at one influence, it might be a little easier to accommodate this than the full set of Lucky finds. Prepaid voice pad decks have fallen out of favor ever since the Most Wanted list really nerfed them, especially Kate. But I think maybe we could see people messing around with those again now that they have 3 copies of Deuces Wild to mess around with. The last runner card in the pack is a run event called Injection Attack. It's 1 to play, it's 0 influence. Make a run and choose an icebreaker. That icebreaker has +2 strength for the remainder of this run. Whether or not this card's going to see any play, I think this thing's kind of lame. I'm not a huge fan of stuff like this where it's just going to be generically easy to break the strength restrictions on icebreakers. Something like Mimic, or I think more importantly Yogg, is going to really like this because you're going to be able to boost the strength, and that's something that the icebreaker can't do innately. So any sort of icebreaker with that kind of thing, this card could maybe be useful. Now, it is a 1-cost event. That +2 strength might not really be worth much more than 1 or 2 credits depending on the breaker, so that's certainly going to limit its playability. I'd also point out that this lasts until the end of the run, so that's going to make it a lot more useful with something that can break all of their ice, like a Faust or other AI breaker. It's going to get +2 strength for every ice in the encounter, so that could definitely add up and be really useful. While I think that this card might see a little bit of fringe play, and it's certainly not an incredibly great card, I really dislike stuff like this where it's really, really easy ways to match strength or aid icebreakers that have bad strength effects. I think one of the few ways that we can actually have icebreakers be restrictive and not able to just break every ice of their type is to give them some sort of strength limitation like Mimic and Yogg have. Going forward, it's going to be able to help break rules on strength restrictions of icebreakers, maybe even icebreakers that haven't been printed yet. That's going to do it for part 1 of my 23 seconds review. Be sure to tune into part 2 where we look at all the corp cards. A lot of great stuff over there. And be sure to subscribe to my channel and give me a thumbs up if you like this video. I'll see you over in part 2.